Hello, and welcome to another episode of the English Talk community. I'm Julia, and I'm so excited to have you here today. If you're listening to this, you're part of a global community that is working together to improve their English skills. And I think you're going to love today's episode. Whether you're a beginner or someone who's been learning English for a while, this episode is for you. And trust me, by the end of it, you'll have some practical tips and insights to make a real difference in your language learning journey. Now, before we dive in, I want to ask you something. Have you ever found yourself translating words in your head before speaking in English? I know, it sounds familiar, right? We all do it at some point, especially when we're trying to speak a new language. But here's the thing. This habit can actually slow down your progress and make it harder for you to speak fluently. If you've been struggling with this, you're not alone. In fact, it's one of the most common challenges faced by learners around the world, no matter where they're from. So, what's going on here? Why do we feel the need to translate every word from our native language to English before we speak? Well, the answer lies in the way we've been taught to learn languages for a long time. Most language learning methods focus a lot on memorizing vocabulary and grammar rules, and they often teach us to directly translate from one language to another. This works fine for reading or writing, but when it comes to speaking, it can really hold you back. Let me tell you a little story about a student of mine named Clara. Clara is from Brazil, and when she started learning English, she had a tough time speaking fluently. Every time she tried to form a sentence, she would mentally translate each word from Portuguese to English before speaking. As you can imagine, this took a lot of time, and by the time she was ready to speak, the moment often passed. She would miss the flow of conversation, and that made her feel frustrated and discouraged. But Clara wasn't alone in this. It's a common experience for many people learning English, especially when their native language is very different from English. You might find yourself thinking in your first language, translating, and then trying to say it in English, only to realize that the sentence doesn't sound right, or that you've taken too long to say what you wanted. This is exactly what we're going to talk about today: how to stop translating in your head and start thinking in English, like a native speaker. When you think in English, you break free from that mental translation process, and you start processing ideas directly in the language you're speaking. This makes you sound more natural, and more importantly, it allows you to speak more fluidly without the constant need to pause and translate every single word. And trust me, once you get the hang of it, it feels amazing. You'll be able to communicate more easily, and it'll give you the confidence to speak up in conversations, whether you're talking to a colleague at work, chatting with friends, or traveling abroad. But I know what you might be thinking right now. How do I actually start thinking in English? Isn't it easier said than done? And you're absolutely right. This isn't something that happens overnight. It's a process, and it takes time and practice. But don't worry. In today's episode, I'm going to share some tips and techniques that will help you make this shift. I promise you'll walk away with a better understanding of how to start thinking in English and why it's so important. Let's take a moment to think about what happens when we translate in our heads. When you translate, you're basically moving through two languages instead of one. This can lead to confusion, slower responses, and sometimes even mistakes because English doesn't always have a direct translation for words or phrases in other languages. For example, in Portuguese, we have the phrase fazer a faculdade, which directly translates to do the college in English. But in English, we say attend college or go to college. That's just one example of how translation can trip us up, and there are many more like it. Another problem with translating in your head is that it interrupts the flow of the conversation. Imagine you're in a conversation, and instead of responding immediately, you're pausing, thinking about how to translate your thoughts, and then trying to say them in English. By the time you speak, the moment has passed, and you're not fully engaged in the conversation anymore. The person you're speaking with might not even realize that you're struggling to keep up. But you feel frustrated because it feels like you're not connecting with the conversation as easily as you'd like to. It doesn't have to be like that, though. What if you could skip the mental translation and just think in English from the start? That's exactly what I want to help you with in this episode. The key is to start small, build your confidence, and slowly train your brain to think in English. It's not as difficult as it sounds, and with the right approach, you'll start noticing a difference in how you speak and how comfortable you feel using English in everyday situations. So, let me ask you again. Have you ever caught yourself translating in your head before speaking? Maybe you've done it today, or maybe it's something that happens regularly. Whatever the case, Now is the time to take action and learn how to stop this habit. In the next part of this episode, I'll share some practical steps to help you begin thinking in English like a native speaker. But before we dive into those tips, take a moment to reflect on your own learning journey. Have you noticed how often you translate, and what do you think might happen if you could start thinking in English right away? Trust me, it's a game changer. Are you ready to dive in and start the process of thinking in English? Let's do it. Together. Let's talk about something that many of us have struggled with at some point when learning English: the challenge of translating in our heads. Have you ever found yourself thinking in your native language and then trying to translate it into English before you speak? Or maybe you're mid-conversation and you're trying to put together a sentence, but you stop because you're translating the words from your first language to English in your mind. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. So, what exactly does it mean to translate in your head? Essentially, it's when you are mentally converting words, phrases, or ideas from your native language into English before you speak or write. Instead of thinking directly in English, your brain is processing the information in your first language and then trying to find the equivalent English words or phrases. This may seem like a natural thing to do when you're still learning a new language, but it can actually slow down your progress and make you feel less confident when speaking. Let's break down why this happens. When you're learning a new language, especially one that is different from your native tongue, it's completely normal to rely on your first language as a bridge. In the beginning stages of learning English, you might not have enough vocabulary or confidence to immediately express yourself in English, so your brain resorts to translating. You think of what you want to say in your first language, and then try to convert that into English. This process of translation can happen automatically and is often an unconscious habit. The problem is that it can interfere with your ability to speak fluidly and naturally. Take a moment to think about this. Imagine you're trying to have a conversation in English, but you're constantly thinking about how to translate every word in your head. For example, let's look at a common sentence. Eu vou para a escola, which translates to I go to school in English. In this case, a Brazilian learner of English might translate it mentally before speaking. They might think, eu vou, I go, and para a escola, to school. While this seems like a simple translation, what happens is that the learner's brain is doing double the work. First, it has to recall the words in Portuguese, then convert those words into their English equivalents. This slows down the speaking process and can cause hesitation. If you are always translating in your head like this, it means you're not really thinking in English. You're thinking in Portuguese first, then trying to match the words. This takes up a lot of mental energy and over time can lead to frustration, because the process of translating doesn't allow you to speak quickly or with ease. You might also notice that the more you translate, the less confident you feel when speaking, because you're not as fluent or natural in your responses. Instead of being able to respond immediately, you find yourself pausing, searching for the right words, and trying to make sure you are translating correctly. Let me share a bit of a personal story to illustrate how this works. I have a student named Carlos who is from Brazil, and he's been learning English for a couple of years now. Carlos was always very careful about his grammar and vocabulary, but whenever we had conversations in English, he would stop midway through a sentence, looking like he was thinking really hard. It wasn't that he didn't know the words, but his mind would often freeze as he tried to translate everything from Portuguese into English before speaking. One day, Carlos said to me, "Julia, I don't understand. I know the words, I understand the grammar, but I just can't speak easily." And that's when it clicked for me. The problem wasn't Carlos's vocabulary or grammar, it was his habit of translating in his head. He was so focused on translating each individual word or phrase that he couldn't put his ideas together quickly. This wasn't just an issue of language skills, it was a problem of mental processing. His brain was so busy doing translation work that it couldn't focus on the natural flow of conversation. Carlos's situation is very common. Many learners, especially those whose native language is structurally different from English, will experience this challenge. For example, let's say you're a speaker of Spanish, Portuguese, or French. In these languages, the sentence structure may be similar to English, so the translation process may seem easier at first. However, even though the words might seem like they translate well, it's important to remember that English has its own unique ways of constructing sentences and expressing ideas. This can cause a lot of confusion when you're translating directly from one language to another. To give you another example, think about the sentence in Portuguese. Eu gosto de viajar. This translates to, I like to travel in English. Now, when a Brazilian speaker says this in their native language, the word order and structure might feel completely natural. But when the same person tries to translate the sentence into English, they may think, eu gosto, I like, but de viajar becomes to travel, which works. But mentally, they are making connections between the two languages. As you can see, while it's a simple translation, the act of translating the idea itself can take time and effort. Instead of thinking, I like to travel, directly in English, the learner is mentally going through the steps to convert it. This is a problem, because the more you translate in your head, the more you reinforce the habit, and this slows down your ability to speak more naturally. It's like you're constantly thinking in two languages instead of one. And when you're in a conversation, that extra mental processing can lead to missed opportunities to communicate clearly and quickly. You might be more concerned about getting the words right than about conveying your ideas clearly and confidently. So why is translating in your head such a big issue? The truth is, when you rely on translation, you're not training your brain to think in English. Instead of developing a direct understanding of the language, you're creating a mental translation cycle that you have to break in order to speak more fluently. This makes it harder to keep up with conversations, especially fast-paced ones, and can lead to frustration. You'll also find yourself getting stuck when you don't know the exact translation for a word or phrase, causing hesitation and slowing down your speech. It's important to understand that translation has its place, especially when you're just starting to learn a language. But as you progress, the goal is to move away from translation and begin thinking directly in English. This shift takes time, but it's absolutely necessary for fluency. Instead of translating, your brain should be able to process information directly in English, and that's how you'll begin to speak more fluidly and confidently. So, next time you catch yourself translating in your head, try to pause and notice what's happening. Are you thinking in your first language and then translating? If so, you're not alone. But this is something we can work on together to break that habit and make speaking English much more natural. It might feel difficult at first, but with practice, you'll start to notice that you can think and speak in English without that extra mental translation step. Let's talk about why it's so important to start thinking in English directly, without translating from your native language. This is something that many language learners, including myself when I first started learning other languages, struggle with. It's tempting to translate words in your head, especially when you're learning a language like English, which can have such different structures and vocabulary compared to other languages. But here's the thing. If you truly want to achieve fluency in English, you need to make the shift from translating to thinking in English. Let me explain why. The first reason is that when you translate in your head, you slow yourself down. Think about it. When you speak, you're trying to communicate your ideas as quickly as possible. The problem with translating is that it's like putting a barrier between what you want to say and how you say it. Your brain has to first translate your thoughts into your native language and then translate that into English. This can cause pauses in your speech, make it harder to express yourself naturally, and even make you miss out on moments in a conversation. Let's take an example. Imagine you're having a conversation in English, and you're thinking of something in your first language, let's say Spanish. Before you can say it in English, you mentally translate the Spanish sentence to English. The problem with this is that in many cases, the exact words and structure don't translate well between languages. And even if they do, this whole process takes time. Native English speakers don't go through that process. They don't stop and think, how do I say this in English? They just know. They think in English because that's their natural language. For them, speaking in English is just like breathing. It happens automatically without needing to translate. Now, I know you might be thinking, but I don't know English well enough to think directly in it. And that's totally understandable. When you're just starting out, translating can feel like the easiest way to understand and speak. It makes sense, right? You hear a word or a phrase and you instantly think of what it means in your first language. But here's the thing. If you continue to rely on translating, you're essentially holding yourself back from truly mastering English. Your goal should be to get to a point where you can think in English without needing that translation step. Let me give you an example of how this works with native speakers. I'm sure many of you have been in situations where you've overheard native English speakers talking, and they seem to be speaking effortlessly. You might have even thought to yourself, how do they do it? Why does it seem so easy for them? Well, it's because they don't have to translate. They grew up hearing and speaking English, so their brains are wired to think in English automatically. They don't have to consciously convert every word or sentence. They simply know what they're trying to say. Imagine a native English speaker named Sarah. Sarah was born in the US and speaks English all day, every day. Let's say she's talking to a friend about her plans for the weekend. She might say something like, "I'm going to visit my parents and maybe catch a movie with some friends." She's not thinking in her head, "How do I say this in English?" Because for Sarah, English is natural. The ideas flow directly from her brain into words in English, without any delay or internal translation. She doesn't have to search for words, and she certainly doesn't have to stop and think, "What does catch a movie mean in my native language?" It just comes out automatically because that's how her brain works. This is what we're aiming for when we're learning English. You want to get to a point where thinking in English becomes as natural as thinking in your first language. Of course, that doesn't happen overnight. It takes time and practice, but it's the ultimate goal for anyone learning English, whether you're just starting out or you've been studying for a while. You might be wondering, but if I don't translate, how do I even begin to think in English? Well, it all comes down to building a new habit. You need to expose yourself to English as much as possible, so that the language starts to feel more familiar. This means listening to English podcasts, watching English TV shows and movies, reading books and articles in English, and speaking as much as possible. The more you immerse yourself in English, the more you start to internalize the language. Over time, you'll begin to recognize words and phrases without needing to translate them. Another key to thinking in English is to focus on context. When we speak in any language, we don't translate every word in our head before saying it. Instead, we understand the meaning of words based on context. In English, we don't need to translate each individual word. Instead, we understand the overall meaning of the sentence. For example, if I say, "I'm going to the store to buy some food," you don't translate every word into your native language. You understand what I'm saying based on the context of the sentence. This is exactly what you need to practice in your own English learning. To further clarify this, think about how children learn their first language. They don't start by translating words into their native language. Instead, they hear words and phrases in context, and over time, they begin to understand their meaning. The more they hear and use the language, the better they get at thinking in it. As an English learner, you should do the same. Don't focus on translating each word in isolation. Instead, focus on learning the meaning of words within the context they are used. At first, this might be challenging because, as a learner, you might not yet be able to understand the full meaning of everything you hear or read. But the more you expose yourself to English, the easier it will become. You'll begin to pick up on patterns in the language, and you'll be able to understand and think in English without needing to translate. Over time, it'll become second nature, and you'll notice a significant improvement in your fluency and confidence when speaking. In the end, the goal is to make thinking in English an automatic process. It won't happen instantly, but it's achievable with consistent practice. Just like Sarah, the native English speaker, you can reach a point where thinking in English feels as natural as thinking in your first language. You won't have to stop and translate every sentence. Instead, your brain will process information directly in English, and the words will flow naturally as you speak. This is what true fluency looks like, and it's something you can definitely achieve with time, practice, and persistence. Let's dive into an important concept. The brain doesn't work in translations. When you're learning English or any other language, one of the most common challenges is the temptation to translate everything from your native language into English. But this constant translation actually slows down the learning process. The more you rely on translating words and phrases, the harder it becomes to speak or think in English naturally. This happens because the brain wasn't designed to translate back and forth between languages every time you speak. Instead, it functions more efficiently when you process and understand language directly, without having to go through a translation filter. Here's the thing. When you translate in your head, you're creating an unnecessary step. Your brain has to work harder to convert words from your first language into English, and this takes more time and energy. Instead of thinking directly in English, you're trying to juggle two languages at once. This mental translation slows you down and makes it harder to respond quickly or naturally in conversations. It can even cause confusion, especially when the languages don't match up perfectly. Let's explore an example to make this clearer. Imagine you're trying to order food at a restaurant in an English-speaking country, and you're used to translating every word in your head. You're looking at the menu and you see the word cheeseburger. In your native language, maybe the word you would use for a similar dish sounds very different or has a slightly different meaning. So you try to translate it. Okay, I need a burger with cheese, right? You're thinking, I know the word cheese and I know burger, so that must be it. But as you're trying to make this translation, you're losing time, and you might not even be confident enough to ask the waiter for help. Then, when the waiter approaches and asks what you'd like to drink, you again translate in your mind, what's the word for water in English again? Oh, right. It's water. And now you're struggling to remember the correct way to phrase things, so you end up hesitating. You're feeling stuck because your brain is overloaded, translating each word and trying to piece together a sentence on the spot. You might even miss out on opportunities to speak more confidently because you're so focused on translating instead of thinking in English. The problem with this approach is that the translation takes time and creates confusion. In real-life situations like this, you might get frustrated, or worse, you could become embarrassed if you struggle to communicate effectively. What's happening is that your brain is constantly switching between two languages, and every time you switch, it takes more time and energy. You're not just thinking in English, you're working through your native language first and then trying to adapt it. This slows your ability to process information and form sentences quickly, making you feel less fluent and more hesitant when speaking. This issue can affect not only conversations, but also your ability to understand others. For example, when you hear someone speak English, instead of processing their words directly, you might first translate what they're saying into your own language and then understand it. This adds another step to your comprehension, and by the time you've translated, you might have missed part of what they said. This can make it difficult to keep up with fast conversations and lose your place in a discussion. Now let's think about another example. Imagine you're at work, and a colleague asks you for help with something. They say, "Can you please send me the report by 3 p.m.?" Your first instinct might be to translate this into your native language, but in this case, you don't need to translate every word. The sentence is simple and clear in English, and you already know what report, send, and 3 p.m. mean in English. But instead of just understanding the meaning directly, your brain still takes that extra step to translate it first. This small delay can cause you to respond more slowly, and you might even hesitate before you reply. If you were thinking in English right away, the sentence would make more sense without needing any translation. You'd immediately understand that your colleague wants the report by 3 p.m. and that you need to act on it. But because your brain is still translating, you might second-guess yourself, and this hesitation can make the interaction feel more awkward than it needs to be. The problem here is that translation doesn't allow you to process language in real time. Instead of just understanding, your brain has to pause and adjust, which takes away from the flow of the conversation. This is why constant translation is a huge barrier to fluency. When you translate in your head, you're not fully engaging with the English language. You're thinking in two languages instead of directly in English. This dual language processing leads to mental overload, confusion, and delays in speaking. It's like trying to drive with the brakes on. You're constantly slowing yourself down even when you don't need to. The solution is to reduce the mental translation and focus on thinking directly in English, as native speakers do. If we look at how native speakers process language, it's clear that they don't translate in their heads. When they hear someone speak, their brains automatically understand the meaning without needing to make a translation. They don't think, okay, I heard the word coffee in English, but what does that mean in my first language? Instead, they just understand what's being said right away. This allows them to process information faster, think more clearly, and speak more confidently. Native speakers also don't have to stop and think about how to phrase things. They just know. It's automatic. If you want to reach this level of fluency in English, you need to train your brain to do the same thing. Instead of translating every word or sentence, start processing information directly in English. You don't need to know every word in English, but by thinking in the language you're learning, you'll gradually become more comfortable and confident. Over time, this mental translation will become less necessary, and you'll be able to respond more quickly, understand more easily, and speak with more fluency. It's also worth noting that the less you translate, the more natural your speech will sound. You'll start to think in phrases, not just individual words. For example, native speakers don't think word by word when they speak. They think in complete sentences or ideas. By practicing thinking in English, you'll start to do the same. This will allow you to speak more naturally without needing to pause and search for words. And as you build more confidence and fluency, you'll find that you can express yourself more freely and effortlessly. So, the next time you catch yourself translating in your head, take a moment to notice it. Can you think directly in English instead? Even if it's just a small sentence, try to process it in English right away. It might feel a bit strange at first, but with practice, you'll find that the more you do it, the easier it becomes. The goal is to train your brain to think in English just like native speakers do, so that you can communicate more effectively, naturally, and confidently. The brain doesn't need to translate. When you think in English, it's ready to process everything directly and smoothly. When we talk about thinking in English, what exactly do we mean? It's one of those phrases that often gets thrown around in language learning circles, but it's not always clear what it actually involves. In simple terms, thinking in English means processing your thoughts directly in English without needing to first translate them from your native language. It's about shifting from relying on translation to a state where English is the language your brain uses automatically. This is a crucial step in becoming fluent in English. When you can think in English, you can speak and understand it much more quickly and naturally, without the mental roadblock that comes from translating words and phrases in your head. Fluency in any language is deeply connected to how well you can think in that language. Think about it. Native speakers don't translate their thoughts into English before they speak. Their brains automatically process their ideas in their first language, and the words come out in the right order and with the right grammar because that's how they've been trained to think. For non-native speakers, achieving this same level of fluency can feel challenging, but it's absolutely possible. The key is to stop mentally translating every sentence, every word, and start thinking directly in English. This allows you to speak more naturally, respond more quickly, and be more confident in your conversations. Now, let me give you an example that might help illustrate what it means to think in English. Imagine a person named Priya, who was born and raised in India. Priya speaks both Hindi and English, but she's been using English as her primary language for many years. She works in a corporate environment where English is the main language of communication, and she spends most of her day reading emails, attending meetings, and chatting with her colleagues in English. Over time, Priya has reached a point where English no longer feels like a foreign language to her. She doesn't need to translate every word from Hindi into English. Instead, when she speaks, she just thinks in English. One day, Priya is chatting with her friends about plans for the weekend. They start talking about a new movie that's coming out, and without even thinking about it, she says, "I can't wait to see it. Let's grab dinner before the movie." In that moment, Priya isn't pausing to think about how to say it in English or what the equivalent phrase is in Hindi. She's simply thinking directly in English because for her, that's the language that feels most natural and immediate. She isn't mentally translating from Hindi to English. The words and ideas come to her automatically because her brain has become so accustomed to thinking in English. This is the essence of thinking in English. It's not about finding the right translation or hesitating to form a sentence. It's about feeling comfortable and confident in using English directly. If you've ever listened to a native English speaker talk, you'll notice how effortlessly the words flow. They don't need to pause and think about the sentence structure or find the right vocabulary. They just speak. This is the result of years of practice and exposure to the language. They've reached the point where thinking in English is second nature. For someone like Priya, who uses English in her daily life, the same thing happens. The more she uses English, the more her brain shifts away from needing to translate. She's thinking directly in English, and because of this, she's able to speak with ease and fluency. This might sound like something that only happens for people who have lived in an English-speaking country for years, but the reality is that you can achieve this too, regardless of where you're from. The process might take time, and it will require consistent practice, but over time, you'll begin to notice that English words and phrases start popping into your mind automatically, just like they do for Priya. It's all about surrounding yourself with English and using it regularly. The more you practice thinking in English, the more natural it will become. For example, if you've been listening to English podcasts, watching English shows, and reading in English, you might have already started to notice that certain phrases or words come to you without translation. Maybe you've been practicing your daily English conversations, and one day, without even realizing it, you find yourself thinking in English while you're on your way to work, or while you're planning your day. This is a sign that your brain is starting to shift toward thinking in English, and that's a huge step toward fluency. The key here is that it happens naturally. It's not forced. It's a gradual process that comes from immersion and regular practice. One of the reasons why thinking in English is so powerful is that it speeds up your ability to speak and respond. When you're constantly translating, you're working harder than you need to. Your brain is processing the language in two stages. First, from your native language into English, and then into speech. This adds extra time to your thinking and speaking process. But when you start thinking directly in English, everything speeds up. Your brain processes information in real time, and you can respond more quickly and fluidly. This is why thinking in English is such a key component of fluency. It allows you to communicate more effectively and with more confidence. Let's take another example. Imagine you're in a meeting at work, and your boss asks for your opinion on a new project. If you're translating your thoughts into English, you might hesitate as you search for the right words or phrases. You might even feel nervous about making a mistake. But if you're thinking directly in English, you'll have a much easier time responding. Your words will come to you faster, and you won't waste time mentally converting your thoughts from your native language into English. The more you practice this process, the more natural it will become, and you'll find that you can contribute to conversations and discussions with much more confidence. The great thing is that thinking in English doesn't have to be limited to just speaking. It also applies to listening, reading, and writing. When you hear someone speak in English, you won't need to translate what they're saying into your native language. You'll start to understand the meaning directly, without that extra step of translation. This is why immersion in English is so important. It allows you to practice thinking in English in all contexts. The more you expose yourself to English, the easier it will be for your brain to process the language directly, and the more fluent you'll become. So, just like Priya, who thinks in English while talking to her friends, you too can reach a point where English becomes the language you think in automatically. It might take some time, but with consistent practice, you'll start to notice that you're no longer translating every word or phrase. You'll be able to think in English directly, and as a result, you'll be able to speak and understand the language with much greater ease and fluency. This is the key to truly mastering English and reaching the level of fluency you've been aiming for. Now that we understand why thinking in English is so important, let's talk about how you can actually start doing it. I know this might sound like a big shift, especially if you've been relying on translation for a long time, but trust me, it's absolutely possible with some practice. The key is to start small and build your way up, just like any other new habit. You're not going to wake up one day and automatically think in English all the time, but you can start taking practical steps that will help your brain make that shift. Over time, you'll find that thinking in English becomes more natural. The first step is to begin with simple, everyday sentences. Don't worry about complex ideas or trying to sound perfect right away. Start by focusing on basic phrases you might use regularly throughout your day. For example, when you wake up, instead of thinking in your native language, try to say simple things like, I need to get up, or I'm going to make breakfast. By using simple sentences that are easy to understand, you're already helping your brain switch from translating into English to simply thinking in it. The goal is to make these thoughts automatic, so they don't feel like a translation anymore. They just feel natural. One of the best ways to start thinking in English is by describing your daily routine. This gives you an easy way to practice thinking in the language without overloading yourself. Think about what you do when you wake up in the morning. In your native language, you might think to yourself, I'm going to get up, take a shower, and have breakfast. Instead of translating these thoughts, try saying them directly in English. I'm going to get up, take a shower, and have breakfast. You can do this for all the steps in your morning routine, like getting dressed, brushing your teeth, and getting ready to go out. By doing this, you're already thinking in English, and you're practicing it in a way that feels relevant and familiar. Another tip is to start focusing on simple conversations you might have throughout the day. For instance, when you're walking through the park or on your way to work, think about the things you see or experience in English. You don't need to overcomplicate things or try to use advanced vocabulary. Just observe the world around you and try to describe it in English. The sky is blue today, or there are a lot of cars on the road. Even if you're just walking down the street, try to put your thoughts into English. This small exercise helps your brain get used to processing thoughts in English instead of translating them from your native language. Let me give you an example of how this works with someone who's starting to think in English. Meet Sophia, an Argentine student who has been learning English for a few years. Sophia speaks both Spanish and English, and while she's been doing well with grammar and vocabulary, she still finds herself translating in her head whenever she speaks. This has slowed her down, especially in conversations, and she knows that in order to get better, she needs to start thinking in English. One morning, Sophia wakes up and decides she's going to try something different. Instead of thinking in Spanish and then translating to English, she decides to speak to herself in English about her day. When she opens her eyes, she says to herself in English, "I'm awake. I'm going to get up and make coffee." As she walks into the kitchen, she thinks, "I need a mug. I want a big cup of coffee today." These are simple, everyday thoughts, but by switching them to English right away, Sophia starts to make the language more present in her mind. It doesn't feel like translating anymore. It feels like she's thinking in English. As Sophia moves through her morning, she continues this practice. When she gets dressed, she thinks in English. "I need to wear a jacket today. It's cold outside." When she gets into her car to head to school, she says to herself, "It's a 20-minute drive. I need to focus on the road." These simple sentences are now part of her everyday routine, and by saying them in English, Sophia's brain starts to form the habit of thinking in English, not in Spanish. She doesn't need to translate "I need a jacket" into Spanish first, because the thought is already in English. It's becoming natural. The beauty of starting with small, everyday tasks is that you don't feel pressured to create complex "I" sentences. You're just describing what's happening around you or what you're planning to do. As you practice these small steps throughout your day, you'll find that it gets easier and easier to think in English. You can gradually add more complex thoughts or conversations as you feel more comfortable. The important part is consistency. Practicing this every day, even if it's just for a few minutes, will help you make thinking in English a habit. Another way to practice thinking in English is to narrate your actions. Let's say you're cooking dinner. Instead of thinking, "I'm going to put the vegetables in the pot," try thinking, "I will add the vegetables to the pot now." If you're walking to the store, think, "I'm walking to the store to buy some bread." By constantly narrating your actions in English, you're actively engaging with the language in a very natural way. This doesn't require any extra effort. It's just part of your daily routine. You might also want to set up moments throughout your day where you consciously practice thinking in English. For example, when you're getting ready to go to bed at night, reflect on your day in English. "What did you do? Today I went to work, met some friends for lunch, and came home." At first, this might feel a little strange, but over time, it will start to feel more comfortable. And you'll notice that as you keep practicing, English will start to become your default language for thinking. The key here is not to stress about perfection or grammar. The goal is to focus on communication and fluency, not on getting every single word or phrase perfect. It's more important to start thinking in English, even if your sentences aren't perfectly structured, than to keep translating everything word for word. The more you practice, the more natural it will feel to think in English, and over time you'll find that you don't need to translate at all anymore. By taking these simple, practical steps, you can start to shift your thinking from translating in your head to thinking directly in English. And just like Sophia, you'll find that the more you practice, the easier it gets. It may feel like a small change at first, but each time you consciously choose to think in English, you're strengthening your connection with the language, making it feel more natural, and moving one step closer to fluency. When we're learning a language, it's easy to get caught up in trying to sound perfect. We often focus on using the right vocabulary, the correct grammar, and constructing complex sentences. But here's the truth. Clarity is far more important than perfection, especially when you're just starting to think in English. In fact, using simple words and sentences can make your communication much more effective and efficient, and it will help you build confidence as you continue learning. The first thing to understand is that complexity doesn't always equal clarity. In many cases, using simple and straightforward language is actually much better than trying to use complicated words or complicated sentence structures. When you focus on clear, simple sentences, you're much more likely to be understood. And that's the key to good communication. It's also a great way to practice thinking in English without the pressure of having to construct perfect, complex sentences. One of the most important tips I can offer you is this: use simple sentences. When you speak or write in English, don't overthink it. Try to express your thoughts in the simplest way possible. This not only makes it easier for the person you're speaking to understand you, but it also helps you keep your focus on thinking in English, rather than getting distracted by complex grammar rules or vocabulary. In fact, using simple language is often a sign of fluency. Native speakers rarely use overly complicated language in everyday conversation. They stick to simple, clear sentences, and they're able to express their ideas effectively and naturally. Let me give you an example. Imagine a Frenchman named Pierre, who works in a company where English is the main language of communication. Pierre speaks English well, but he's always been a bit nervous about speaking because he tends to overthink things. He worries about making mistakes and tries to use complex vocabulary and phrases to sound more professional or fluent. This has sometimes led to confusion, because his sentences don't come out as smoothly as he wants them to. Pierre realizes that he's been focusing too much on sounding perfect, and it's slowing him down in his daily work. One day, Pierre decides to change his approach. Instead of trying to impress his colleagues with fancy vocabulary and intricate sentences, he decides to focus on using simple, clear language. He wants to be understood first and foremost, and he understands that clarity is key. For instance, when he's giving a status update during a meeting, instead of saying, "I am currently in the process of completing the task, but I am encountering some obstacles which may cause a slight delay," he simplifies it to, "I'm working on the task, but there are some problems. It might be late." The message is still the same, but now it's much clearer and easier to understand. Pierre also starts to apply this principle in his emails. Instead of writing long, complicated sentences, he keeps things short and to the point. For example, instead of saying, "I would like to kindly request that you provide the necessary information at your earliest convenience so that I can proceed with the next steps in the project," he writes, "Can you send the information so I can keep moving forward with the project?" Again, the meaning is clear and the language is simple. This approach not only makes his communication more efficient, but it also boosts his confidence. He doesn't feel the pressure of trying to sound perfect anymore. He knows that getting his message across clearly is what matters most. The benefits of using simple language go beyond just making your speech easier to understand. When you focus on simplicity, you free up mental energy that can be used for other things, like listening and responding. If you're constantly trying to figure out the right words or constructing complex sentences in your head, you're spending valuable time and energy on translation and grammar, which can slow you down and make you less effective in conversations. But when you keep it simple, you can focus on the message you want to communicate, rather than on finding the perfect words. Let's talk about the importance of clarity for a moment. When you speak or write in simple, clear sentences, you avoid the risk of saying something that could be misunderstood. Sometimes when we try to use big words or complicated sentences, the meaning can get lost or the listener might misinterpret what we're saying. Simple language helps to avoid confusion and ensures that your point is clear. This is especially important when you're learning a new language, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're unsure whether your message is coming across the way you intended. Take a moment to think about it. When you're listening to someone speak, do you prefer them to use long, complicated sentences, or do you appreciate it when they speak clearly and directly? Most of us would prefer the latter. It's easier to follow, and it makes the conversation flow more smoothly. The same principle applies when you're speaking in English. By keeping your sentences short and straightforward, you make it easier for your listener to understand you, and you build a stronger connection with them. Now let's consider another example. Imagine you're in a job interview or a business meeting. It's natural to want to sound professional and impress the people you're talking to. However, trying to use fancy vocabulary or overly complex language can sometimes have the opposite effect. Instead of sounding more professional, you might come across as less clear or harder to understand. In these situations, it's better to keep your language simple and focused on your message. Saying something like, "I have experience working on several projects where I worked as part of a team, and I helped to solve problems and meet deadlines," is much more effective than trying to use complex phrases like, "I have had the privilege of being involved in multiple projects, where I was a collaborative partner who contributed to problem solving and ensuring that timelines were adhered to." Both sentences convey the same idea, but the simpler one is clearer and easier to follow. And this is exactly how you want to communicate when you're speaking in English: clearly, directly, and without overcomplicating things. By focusing on simplicity, you also allow yourself more room to improve. When you try to use simpler words and sentences, you give yourself a solid foundation to build on. As you become more comfortable with these basic structures, you'll gradually start to incorporate more complex vocabulary and sentence patterns. But it's important to remember that complexity shouldn't be your starting point. Simplicity is your friend, especially when you're just starting out or when you're practicing thinking in English. So, remember, clarity is the key. Using simple, clear language not only makes you a better communicator, but it also helps you feel more confident and natural in your English-speaking abilities. Whether you're at work, talking with friends, or just practicing on your own, keep your sentences simple. Start with basic phrases and gradually build up to more complex ones as you get more comfortable. This will make you more fluent, more confident, and more effective in English. When it comes to language learning, one of the most effective ways to make words and phrases stick in your mind is by connecting them to feelings and images. This approach is especially powerful when you're trying to move beyond translation and start thinking directly in English. The idea is simple. When you associate a word with something meaningful, whether it's an emotion or a mental image, it becomes easier to recall and use in conversation. By creating these associations, you're embedding English words and phrases more deeply in your mind, which is exactly what you want when trying to think in English. Imagine this scenario. You're learning the word delicious in English. Instead of just memorizing the definition, you could think about a time when you tasted something that truly stood out to you, like your favorite dish. The next time you hear the word delicious, instead of translating it in your mind, you might picture that moment of eating something you loved and the feeling of satisfaction you had. That's the power of associating words with personal experiences, feelings, and images. The word delicious is no longer just a textbook term. It becomes tied to a specific memory or sensation, making it easier for you to use it naturally when speaking in English. One of the reasons this method is so effective is that emotions and images are powerful triggers for memory. We tend to remember things more vividly when they're connected to something that stirs us emotionally or visually. This is why associating words with these triggers can make your language learning process much more efficient. Instead of memorizing long lists of words or translating everything in your head, you're letting your brain create a mental map of the language that is rich in meaning and connection. Now, let me give you an example of how this works in practice. Imagine a man named Hiroshi, a native Japanese speaker who's been learning English for a few years. Hiroshi has learned a lot of vocabulary, but he still finds himself translating from Japanese to English when he speaks, and that slows him down in conversations. He knows that in order to improve, he needs to stop relying on translation and start thinking directly in English. So, Hiroshi decides to try a new approach. He begins associating English words with images and feelings from his own life. One day, Hiroshi is sitting in a cafe with his friends, and they start talking about their favorite foods. Hiroshi immediately thinks about his favorite dish, sushi. But instead of thinking about how to say sushi in English, he pictures the sushi in front of him, the fresh fish, the rice, the delicate presentation. He remembers the taste of the soy sauce, the texture of the rice, and the satisfaction he feels when he takes the first bite. When his friend asks him about his favorite food, instead of translating from Japanese, Hiroshi simply describes it in English, using the word delicious to describe the taste. In that moment, the word delicious is no longer just a vocabulary term, it's connected to the strong image and emotion of enjoying his favorite meal. He doesn't have to think about the word delicious anymore. It flows naturally because it's tied to something real in his life. Hiroshi also starts to use this technique with other words. When talking about his hometown in Japan, he remembers the beautiful parks and temples, the sounds of the streets, and the smell of the fresh air. These images and emotions help him describe his hometown in English without translating word for word. He can now talk about peaceful parks and bustling streets because he associates these words with the feelings and images he has of those places. The words are no longer abstract concepts. They are connected to the sensory experiences that Hiroshi has had, making them much easier to recall and use in conversation. This technique works because it taps into the way our brains naturally learn. When we experience something, whether it's tasting food, hearing music, or seeing a beautiful scene, our brains create strong associations between the sensory input and the words we use to describe them. By actively connecting words with those sensory experiences, You create a powerful mental map that makes it easier to think in English without having to translate every word in your head. This is a much faster and more efficient way to learn because you're not just memorizing definitions, you're connecting words to the real world around you. Let's consider another example of how feelings and images can make learning English more effective. Think about the word exciting. For many people, it can be a challenge to remember such abstract adjectives, especially when they're not associated with any personal experience. But if you associate the word exciting with an event in your serious life, it becomes much more memorable. Perhaps you think about the time you went to a concert, felt the adrenaline rush, and saw your favorite band perform live. You associate the word exciting with that feeling of anticipation and joy. The next time you use the word exciting, it will be easier because you've connected it to a real emotional experience. You're not just remembering a word, you're recalling the thrill of the concert, which makes it feel more natural to use in conversation. This strategy doesn't only work for adjectives. It can be applied to any part of language learning. Take verbs, for example. If you think about the word run, you might remember the feeling of running through the park on a sunny day, or perhaps the sound of your feet hitting the pavement. The word run becomes more meaningful because it's linked to your own personal experience. You can think about it in English without needing to translate it from your native language because the word run is no longer just an abstract idea, it's tied to your own memories and experiences. The key here is to make the language relevant to you. By associating English words with real-life images and feelings, you create a mental framework that makes it easier to recall and use the language. This helps you bypass the translation process, allowing you to think directly in English. The more you use this technique, the more natural it will feel to think in English rather than translating from your native language. So the next time you learn a new word in English, try to connect it to something personal, something that evokes an image or an emotion. Think about how that word applies to your own experiences and create a mental picture that helps you remember it. This method will not only improve your memory of words, but will also make it easier for you to use them in conversations without hesitation. And over time, as you continue to make these connections, thinking in English will start to feel more and more natural, just like Hiroshi and his experience with sushi. One of the most powerful techniques for moving away from translating in your head and starting to think directly in English is the practice of replacing translations with mental images. This method is based on the idea that your brain processes information faster and more naturally when it is connected to real-life experiences, sensations, and scenarios, rather than trying to mentally translate words from one language to another. By creating vivid mental images of the situations you want to talk about or think about in English, you allow yourself to bypass the need for translation and directly connect with the language in a way that feels natural and intuitive. Think about it this way. When you think about your day, the things you do, the places you go, or the people you interact with, you don't typically think in a foreign language first. You might think in terms of feelings, sights, sounds, and movements. These are the things your brain automatically processes and stores, and this is how you should approach learning English. Rather than translating each word or sentence in your head, try to visualize the experience in its entirety in English. This can make learning the language feel more fluid and less like a series of disconnected steps. Let me give you a clear example of how this works. Imagine someone from Mexico, let's call her Maria, who is learning English. Maria is trying to improve her fluency, and she often finds herself translating everything she wants to say in her head before speaking. For example, when she wakes up in the morning and thinks about what she's going to do that day, she might first think, Tengo que levantarme, me voy a duchar, voy a preparar el desayuno, which translates to, I have to get up, I'm going to shower, I'm going to make breakfast. The translation process takes a bit of time and interrupts the flow of her thoughts. One day, Maria decides to try a new approach to break away from this cycle of translation. Instead of translating each word or sentence, she starts to visualize herself doing her daily activities, but this time, she imagines herself describing them in English. When Maria wakes up, she no longer mentally translates, Tengo que levantarme. Instead, she visualizes the action of getting out of bed and sees herself saying, I have to get up in English, as she imagines the movement and feeling of stretching her arms in the morning. She doesn't focus on the translation at all. She simply thinks of the action and connects it with the English phrase. The same happens when she envisions taking a shower. She imagines the sound of water running and feels the warmth of the water, and she associates this mental image with the English words, "I'm going to take a shower." As Maria continues this practice, she notices that it's becoming easier to think in English throughout the day. When she's at work and has to prepare a report, instead of translating "tengo que hacer el informe," I have to do the report, she envisions the act of writing the report, thinking about the task at hand, and her brain naturally connects it to the phrase, "I need to write the report," in English. Over time, this method becomes more effective, and Maria finds herself thinking directly in English without having to translate first. She starts associating the words with the physical actions, objects, and experiences she's encountering, and that makes the language feel more immediate and relevant. This technique is effective for several reasons. First, it eliminates the extra step of translation, which often slows down thinking and speaking. When you visualize an action or situation in English, you are connecting the words directly to the experience itself. This makes the language feel more natural and less like an abstract concept that needs to be translated. Your brain becomes more accustomed to using English in the same way it uses your native language, by connecting words with the actual experiences you're having. Another benefit of this method is that it helps reinforce vocabulary and sentence structures. For instance, by thinking about a daily activity like eating breakfast and visualizing the process in English, you start to recall and use the vocabulary related to that activity more easily. The more you associate these words and phrases with real-life situations, the stronger those connections become in your memory. When Maria imagines sitting down to eat her meal and describes it in English, she reinforces her vocabulary related to food and meals. She might think about the word toast, the word coffee, or even the verb eat in the context of her morning routine. These words become more ingrained in her mind because they are tied to her personal experience, not just the abstract definitions in a dictionary. As you practice visualizing your daily activities in English, you might also find that you begin to naturally use more complex sentence structures. The more you picture yourself engaging in different scenarios, the more you'll notice yourself thinking in longer, more descriptive sentences. For example, when Maria imagines going to the supermarket, she might start by simply thinking about the basic action, "I need to buy groceries," but then she might add more details as she visualizes the process. "I need to buy eggs, milk, and bread, and then I'll stop by the fruit section to pick up some apples." This kind of detailed thinking helps her expand her vocabulary and practice using more complex sentence structures in context. It's no longer about just translating individual words, but using the language in a fluid, natural way to describe a scene or action in its entirety. Another reason why visualizing situations in English is so helpful is that it allows you to practice thinking in the language in a stress-free environment. When you are in the comfort of your own home or engaging in a routine task, you don't have the pressure of a conversation or an exam hanging over your head. This gives you the freedom to make mistakes and experiment with the language without fear of judgment. You can practice imagining yourself in all sorts of situations, from having a conversation with a friend to giving a presentation at work, without worrying about whether you're saying things perfectly. The more you practice this kind of thinking, the more natural it will become. Visualizing situations in English also helps you develop what is known as contextual fluency. This means that you are able to understand and use language based on the context of a situation, rather than relying on memorized phrases or translations. When Maria visualizes herself talking to a colleague about a work project, she's not thinking about the exact translation of the words. Instead, she's thinking about the context of the conversation, the task at hand, the tone of the discussion, and the role of each person in the conversation. This kind of fluency is essential for real-world communication because it allows you to respond to situations quickly and appropriately without needing to translate or hesitate. By replacing translation with mental images, you shift from being a passive learner who memorizes words and phrases to an active thinker who uses language as a tool to describe the world around them. The more you practice this, the more natural it will feel to think in English. Just like Maria, you'll find that your ability to understand, process, and speak in English improves rapidly as you start to connect the language to your own personal experiences and daily activities. One of the most effective ways to break free from translating in your head and start thinking in English directly is by incorporating the practice of substituting your internal thoughts into English throughout your day. The idea is to gradually shift your thinking process so that your brain starts to operate in English, just like it does in your native language. This may sound challenging at first, but with consistent practice, it becomes easier and more natural. The key is to start small and apply this technique to everyday situations where you don't need to translate or pause to think about the words you want to use. Let's think about it this way. You don't have to wait until you're in a conversation or in a formal language learning situation to practice thinking in English. The more you practice in your daily life, the quicker you'll make progress. This could mean thinking in English when you're walking down the street, when you're in the shower, or while you're doing your laundry. These seemingly small moments can add up to a lot of practice over time, and they allow you to make the process of thinking in English a habit. One simple but effective way to begin is by focusing on the most common and basic activities that you already do every day. These could be things like grocery shopping, cleaning your house, or cooking. The goal is to replace the internal dialogue that typically happens in your native language with English. Let me give you an example of how this works in practice. Imagine a Brazilian woman named Ana. Ana is in her mid-20s and has been learning English for a while, but she finds herself still thinking in Portuguese when she's trying to speak. She knows she has to make a change if she wants to improve her fluency. So, Ana decides to try a new approach. She is going to practice thinking in English throughout her daily routine, starting with something simple: grocery shopping. One afternoon, Ana goes to the local supermarket. As she walks into the store, she decides that, for the next hour, she will only think in English. At first, she's a little nervous. The thought of not translating everything feels foreign to her. But she pushes those doubts aside and decides to start small. The first task is to look at the shopping list she's written. In Portuguese, it says, tomates, arroz, feijão, carne. Instead of translating each item, she looks at the list and simply tries to think of the words in English. Tomatoes, rice, beans, meat. It's not perfect, but it's a start. She doesn't need to pause and translate each time. Instead, she's slowly getting used to mentally switching to English as she sees the items. As she moves through the aisles, Ana continues practicing. She picks up a pack of tomatoes and thinks, "These tomatoes look fresh." In her mind, she's now processing the situation entirely in English. Even when she picks up a bag of rice, instead of thinking, "Eu vou pegar o arroz," she thinks, "I'm going to get the rice." It's a small change, but it's a big step in the right direction. Her brain starts to make the connection between everyday tasks and thinking in English without having to translate back and forth. It might take a little longer at first, but over time, these moments of thinking in English become more automatic. At first, Ana's brain wants to revert back to Portuguese, especially when she comes across a word or item she's not sure about. But rather than stopping and trying to figure out the Portuguese equivalent, Ana pushes herself to continue in English. For example, when she needs to buy some fruit, she might be unsure of the word for maçã. But instead of translating it to Portuguese in her head, she tries to picture the fruit in her mind and think of it in English. She sees a red apple in front of her and without thinking twice says, "I'll buy an apple." It's a simple phrase, but by actively thinking in English, Ana is reinforcing the habit of connecting words with real-life experiences. It doesn't matter if she's not perfect or if she makes mistakes. The important part is that she's practicing. As Ana continues down the aisles, she starts to think in English even when she's not looking at specific items on her list. For instance, when she reaches for a carton of milk, she doesn't think, "Preciso comprar leite." Instead, she thinks, "I need to buy milk." When she notices a sale on yogurt, she might think, "This yogurt is on sale," without pausing to translate. Slowly, her brain starts to make these connections without even needing to think consciously about it. What started as a small effort to replace Portuguese with English in one context, grocery shopping, begins to expand into other areas of her life as well. By the end of her shopping trip, Ana feels a sense of accomplishment. Although it was challenging at first, she begins to realize that thinking in English, even for small activities like grocery shopping, is possible. The more she practices, the easier it will become. She doesn't need to rely on translation anymore. She can now think about her shopping list, her purchases, and the experience itself directly in English. And over time, this skill starts to transfer to other parts of her life. The next time Ana has a conversation in English with a friend, she finds that her thoughts are more fluid, her responses come faster, and she doesn't need to translate as much. Ana also starts to realize that this technique is helpful in many situations outside of the grocery store. Whether she's cooking dinner, commuting to work, or meeting a friend for coffee, she begins to practice thinking in English during those moments too. The key is that she doesn't need to make a special effort or carve out specific study time to practice thinking in English. She simply integrates it into her daily life, gradually replacing the habit of translating with the habit of thinking directly in the language. This approach works for anyone, regardless of the level of proficiency in English. By incorporating this simple, practical tip into your daily routine, whether you're at home, at work, or running errands, you're actively practicing the skill of thinking in English. As Anna experienced, the more you replace your internal dialogue with English, the less dependent you will become on translating in your head. Your brain will start to think in English automatically, and before long, you will realize that you've stopped translating altogether. You'll simply be thinking and speaking in English naturally. When it comes to learning a new language, one of the most important shifts that a learner needs to make is in how they think about the language. This shift, known as mental accommodation, is the process by which your brain adapts to thinking directly in the target language, without needing to translate back and forth between your native language and English. Over time, the more you practice this mental transition, the easier it becomes to think and speak in English as naturally as you do in your native language. In the beginning, this shift can feel challenging, as you're used to translating everything in your head before you speak. But as you practice, your brain starts to make new connections. It begins to recognize English words, phrases, and sentence structures as part of your cognitive framework. This process doesn't happen overnight, but with consistent practice, your brain slowly starts to operate in English. And when this mental accommodation happens, you'll notice a dramatic improvement in your ability to think, understand, and speak more naturally in English. Let's take a look at how this process works in action by considering the example of an Italian man named Marco. Marco has been learning English for a couple of years, and although he's made significant progress in understanding and speaking the language, he still finds himself mentally translating every sentence before speaking. For example, when Marco wants to say, "I am going to the store," he first thinks about the Italian equivalent vado al negozio, and then translates it into English. This is a very common habit for language learners, and it's often a necessary stage in the learning process. But Marco knows that if he wants to become fluent, he needs to break free from this pattern of translation and start thinking directly in English. Marco decides to focus on a simple strategy. He's going to practice thinking in English during his daily routine, making sure that he stops translating each sentence in his head. He starts with one of the simplest yet most essential activities of his day: his morning routine. Every day, Marco wakes up, gets out of bed, and prepares his breakfast. In the past, he would have mentally translated everything he was doing, thinking in Italian and then converting it to English. But now he's determined to change that. One morning, Marco wakes up and starts by visualizing the actions he's about to take. But this time, he focuses on thinking directly in English. Instead of thinking, "Mi sveglio e vado in cucina," which means, "I wake up and go to the kitchen" in English, Marco simply visualizes himself getting out of bed and heading to the kitchen while saying to himself, "I wake up and go to the kitchen." It's not perfect, but it's a start. He doesn't think about the Italian translation. He just focuses on the actions and uses English to describe them. At first, Marco finds this a little difficult, but with practice, he begins to notice that his brain starts to connect the words "wake up" and "go to the kitchen" with the actual physical actions. It no longer feels like he's translating from Italian. He's thinking about the action itself, and English just becomes the natural way to express it. Every time he practices this, his brain adapts more and more to thinking directly in English, making the process smoother and more automatic. Marco continues this practice throughout his day. When he's having breakfast, he imagines himself making a cup of coffee. Instead of translating the phrase "faccio un caffè," "I make a coffee," from Italian to English in his head, he simply thinks, "I make a coffee." As he continues practicing, he starts to notice a shift in his thinking. The more he visualizes himself completing tasks and describing them in English, the less he has to consciously think about the translation. It becomes more fluid, like a second nature. For example, when Marco is getting dressed and thinking about his shirt, he no longer translates "mi metto la camicia," "I put on the shirt," from Italian to English. He simply thinks, "I put on the shirt." This process of mental accommodation is gradual. The first few days, it might feel awkward. Marco might catch himself translating, but the more he practices, the easier it becomes. He realizes that he doesn't need to worry about every single word. His goal is not to get every detail right, but to stop translating altogether. As he continues practicing, Marco begins to notice that he's no longer thinking about English as a foreign language. It's just a language he uses to express his thoughts, just like Italian. Another part of Marco's mental accommodation comes when he engages in conversations with others. Before, Marco would constantly translate phrases in his head before speaking, which slowed him down. Now, because he's been practicing thinking in English throughout his daily routine, he starts to notice that when he talks to people, he's able to respond much faster. He's not pausing to mentally translate anymore. For example, when his friend asks him what he did over the weekend, Marco no longer has to translate the question and then translate his answer back into English. He simply responds in English without any hesitation. I went to the park and played soccer with my friends. Marco's experience is a great example of how the brain adapts to thinking directly in English. The process of mental accommodation requires patience and persistence, but the rewards are significant. The more Marco practices, the more he finds himself thinking and speaking in English without needing to translate. He begins to formulate sentences in English without even thinking about it. It's no longer a conscious effort, it becomes a natural part of his thought process. This is how the mental accommodation process works. Your brain starts to recognize that thinking in English is not an extra step, but rather the most efficient and natural way to communicate. The more you practice using English in real-life situations, the more this adaptation takes place. It's important to understand that this process is not about perfection, it's about consistency. The more you practice thinking in English, the faster your brain will adapt, and the more fluent you will become. The key to this process is immersion. By actively engaging in situations where you are forced to think and speak in English, you create an environment that accelerates your brain's ability to switch between languages. This is how fluency is achieved. It's not about memorizing vocabulary or grammar rules. It's about rewiring your brain to naturally think in the language you want to speak. Marco's journey is just one example of how this process of mental accommodation works. It's a gradual but incredibly rewarding experience. And with consistent effort, anyone can experience the same transformation. Whether you're just starting out or have been learning English for a while, remember that the brain is highly adaptable. The more you practice thinking directly in English, the easier it will be to form sentences, express ideas, and understand the language. It's a skill that, once developed, will make all the difference in your journey to fluency. The importance of consistency in language learning cannot be overstated, especially when it comes to making the shift from translating to thinking directly in English. Language learning, like any new skill, requires a regular commitment to practice. It's not about occasional bursts of intense study or trying to cram everything in at once. Instead, the key to progress is consistent practice, day in, day out. By setting aside time each day to practice your English, even if it's just a few minutes, you begin to build new habits and reinforce the neural pathways that will allow you to think in English more naturally. When it comes to thinking in English, the goal is to gradually stop relying on translation and to develop the ability to understand and express yourself directly in the language. This doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen without effort. But through consistent, daily practice, you can retrain your brain to think in English more easily, making it second nature. The more you expose yourself to English, the more your brain becomes accustomed to using it as its primary language of thought. Over time, you will find that you are able to hold conversations, process information, and express yourself with less and less mental translation. Let's take a look at the story of Oliver, an Englishman who, despite being a native speaker of the language, had struggled with fluency in different contexts, particularly in more formal situations or when interacting with speakers of other languages. Oliver had lived in a small town for most of his life, where the primary language was, of course, English. However, when he moved to a larger city for work, he realized that he was often overwhelmed in meetings and presentations, especially when communicating with international colleagues. Despite knowing English for his entire life, he found himself searching for words, pausing mid-sentence to collect his thoughts, and sometimes even reverting to simpler phrases because his mind couldn't keep up. Oliver had always been comfortable with casual conversations, but in more professional or complex situations, his brain seemed to freeze up. This was partly because, even though English was his first language, he had not practiced thinking in it at the level required for these more demanding situations. His language use had been mostly automatic, based on years of familiarity with English in informal settings. In work meetings, however, he found himself mentally translating his thoughts into more formal, precise language, which slowed him down. He realized that the problem wasn't a lack of English knowledge, but rather his inability to think in English fluidly when the situation demanded it. So, Oliver decided to take action. He committed to improving his fluency by practicing thinking in English every day. He didn't try to overwhelm himself by diving into long, complex texts or conversations right away. Instead, he started small. He set aside 10 minutes every morning just after breakfast to focus solely on thinking in English. For those 10 minutes, Oliver would silently go through his daily routine, thinking about what he would do throughout the day, what he was looking forward to, and even reflecting on past events, without speaking or translating into his native language. At first, it felt awkward. He caught himself mentally slipping into his native language, but he stayed persistent. Oliver didn't stop there. He also made sure to incorporate English into his day in other ways. While commuting to work, he would practice mentally describing what he saw, people on the street, buildings, the weather, thinking in English as he observed the world around him. When he would visit the grocery store, he would mentally list the items he needed to buy in English. The key was that Oliver was integrating English into his daily activities in a way that allowed him to think in English, not just translate back and forth between languages. The more he practiced, the more natural it became. He stopped trying to force himself to think in perfect sentences, and instead, he allowed himself to simply process information in English as it came. Within a few weeks of this daily practice, Oliver started to notice changes. He found that he could hold his thoughts in English for longer periods without switching back to his native language. He started to feel more confident in meetings at work and during conversations with international colleagues. The constant mental translation was no longer there, and he could engage in conversations with more fluidity and ease. What was most encouraging was that Oliver realized he didn't need to think about the language so much. Instead of focusing on how to say something correctly, he was able to simply express himself in a more natural way, as if he were thinking in his first language. This gradual improvement didn't happen because Oliver was memorizing new vocabulary or practicing grammar rules intensively. It happened because he was committing to a simple daily practice of thinking in English. By practicing for just 10 minutes every day, he was able to make a mental shift that brought him closer to fluency. His brain became accustomed to thinking in English without the need for translation, and this consistent practice gave him the mental tools to respond faster and more naturally in conversations. Oliver's experience teaches us an important lesson. Consistency is the key to fluency. It's not about making huge leaps in your progress all at once. Rather, it's about committing to small, consistent steps every day. By practicing your English daily, even if it's just for a few minutes, you're making your brain more comfortable with the language. You're allowing yourself to think in English instead of constantly relying on translation, which is the ultimate goal for anyone looking to speak more fluently. Remember, the process of learning a language, especially when it comes to thinking directly in that language, takes time. But if you stay consistent, if you continue to practice each and every day, you will eventually see the results. Just like Oliver, you'll start to notice that your brain is automatically processing information in English, and you won't have to work as hard to form sentences or understand what's being said. The more you practice, the more fluent you will become. So, the next time you find yourself struggling to think in English, remember, consistency is the secret ingredient to success. Keep practicing, and with time, you'll see how your ability to think in English grows stronger and more natural. Incorporating English into your daily routine is one of the most effective ways to improve your language skills and get closer to thinking in English naturally. It's not just about studying grammar or vocabulary lists, but about immersing yourself in the language and making it a part of your everyday life. By doing this, you'll create an environment where English becomes a regular, almost automatic part of how you think and communicate. One of the most important aspects of learning a language is exposure. The more you hear, see, and interact with the language, the more familiar it becomes. Incorporating English into your daily routine doesn't mean that you have to spend hours studying or forcing yourself to practice. It can be much simpler than that. By making small changes in your everyday life, you can create opportunities to practice and use English naturally, even in your free time. These changes don't require a major time commitment or drastic lifestyle adjustments. They simply involve integrating English into activities that you already do on a regular basis. Let's start with something as simple as watching TV or movies. A great way to practice English is by watching content in the language, especially movies or TV shows. This helps you get used to the natural flow of the language, the intonation, and common expressions that are often used in everyday conversation. If you're used to watching movies or shows with subtitles in your native language, it can be very tempting to continue relying on those subtitles. However, this often leads to passive learning, where you might understand the meaning of words, but you're not actively processing the language in real time. One of the most effective methods for improving your listening and comprehension skills is to start watching movies or shows in English without subtitles, or at least without subtitles in your native language. Let's take the example of Sarah, a Canadian who has been learning French for several years. She realized that to improve her fluency in French, she needed to immerse herself in the language. Sarah was already a fluent English speaker, but she knew that to really improve her French, she had to think in French and hear it spoken naturally in everyday situations. She decided to incorporate French into her daily routine in a way that felt natural and enjoyable. Sarah started watching her favorite shows in French, but here's the twist. She watched them without the French subtitles. In the beginning, it was challenging, and she didn't always catch every word or phrase. But over time, she noticed a significant improvement in her comprehension. She began to pick up on common expressions, phrases, and even the cultural nuances that are so important in understanding a language. By watching content without subtitles, Sarah was forced to rely on the context and visual cues, which helped her learn to think in French and process the language more quickly. You might be wondering how this applies to English. Well, the same concept can work for anyone looking to improve their English. Watching movies or TV shows in English without subtitles forces you to engage with the language more actively. It helps you get used to hearing different accents, dialects, and speaking speeds. You might not catch everything at first, and that's perfectly fine. The goal is to gradually improve your ability to understand and follow conversations in English. The more you expose yourself to English in this way, the more comfortable you will become with the language, and you'll start to recognize familiar words and phrases without needing to translate them. The key is to choose content that you enjoy, and that is at a level that challenges you, but not too much that it becomes overwhelming. If you're a beginner, start with shows or movies that are aimed at a younger audience, as the language tends to be simpler and easier to follow. For example, animated movies or TV shows designed for children often use clear, simple English and slower-paced dialogue. As your skills improve, you can move on to more complex content. Besides watching movies, there are other ways to incorporate English into your daily life. Another idea is to change the language settings on your phone, social media accounts, or apps to English. This might seem like a small change, but it's an easy way to surround yourself with English without any extra effort. You'll start to see more of the language in your daily interactions, whether it's when you check your messages, browse social media, or use apps. It helps you become more familiar with common phrases, commands, and vocabulary, and you'll begin to understand how the language is used in everyday contexts. Another simple way to practice English every day is by listening to podcasts, music, or audiobooks in English. This can be done during your commute, while exercising, or even while doing household chores. Podcasts are particularly useful because they often feature conversations on a wide variety of topics, so you can learn English in different contexts. Listening to different voices, accents, and speaking styles can help you become more adaptable to various forms of communication. It also helps you practice your listening comprehension skills, which are crucial for understanding spoken English in real-life situations. You can also try to make small changes to your daily routine to incorporate more English into your life. For instance, you could start keeping a journal in English, where you write down your thoughts or what happened during your day. This helps you practice thinking and writing in English, and it's a great way to track your progress over time. You could also try to have short conversations with yourself in English. Whether you're talking about your plans for the day, describing what you see around you, or just expressing your thoughts, speaking out loud in English, even when no one else is around, can make a huge difference. Even when you're not actively studying English, there are opportunities to practice the language every day. Think about how often you interact with your environment and how you can make those moments into practice opportunities. If you're grocery shopping, for example, try to think of the names of the items in English. When you're out for a walk, describe what you see in English. You don't need to have a conversation with someone else to practice your English. You can do it in your mind in your own way. Over time, these small practices add up, and you'll begin to think in English more naturally. The goal is to surround yourself with English in a way that feels natural and sustainable for your lifestyle. Whether it's watching movies, listening to podcasts, or making simple changes to your routine, the more you integrate English into your daily life, the more fluent you will become. The key is to make English a regular part of what you do every day, no matter how small the actions may seem. With consistency and patience, you'll begin to notice that English is no longer just something you study, but a language that's woven into your everyday thoughts and experiences. And that's when real progress happens. Overcoming psychological barriers is one of the most significant challenges in language learning, particularly when it comes to speaking a new language like English. Many learners struggle with self-doubt, fear of making mistakes, and the overwhelming urge to translate words from their native language before speaking. This mental translation process often hinders fluency, but it's also a key obstacle that can be overcome with the right approach. By learning to stop translating in your head, you can start building the confidence needed to speak English more naturally and fluently. One of the main reasons people hesitate to speak in English is the fear of making mistakes. This fear is often rooted in the idea that speaking the language incorrectly will make others judge them, or that they'll be misunderstood. It's common for learners to focus too much on finding the exact translation of each word before speaking, and this can create a mental block. Instead of confidently expressing themselves, they may freeze up, unsure whether their sentence is correct or how to convey their thoughts without the safety net of translation. The key to overcoming these psychological barriers is to build confidence in thinking and speaking in English without constantly relying on translation. When you stop translating mentally, you begin to trust your ability to communicate directly in English, which helps to reduce anxiety and hesitation. This shift in mindset is incredibly empowering because it takes away the fear of making mistakes and allows you to focus on the message you want to convey, rather than obsessing over grammar or vocabulary. Let's take the example of Olga, a Russian woman who had been learning English for several years. Olga was very good at understanding English when she read or listened to it, but when it came to speaking, she struggled. She always found herself translating from Russian to English in her head before speaking. This constant translation made her feel slow and unsure of herself. Every time she tried to say something, she would hesitate, trying to figure out the best translation for the words she wanted to use. As a result, she often became frustrated and avoided speaking in English altogether, even though she could understand it well. Olga knew she needed to improve her speaking skills, but felt overwhelmed by the idea of speaking without translating. She realized that the root of her problem wasn't her knowledge of English, but rather her mental translation process. To overcome this, she decided to take a new approach. Instead of focusing on translating every word in her head, she began practicing thinking in English. At first, it was challenging. Olga would be doing daily tasks like grocery shopping and find herself automatically translating everything from Russian to English. However, she made a conscious effort to stop translating and started thinking in English as she went about her day. For example, when she was in the store, instead of thinking, "I need to buy milk," and then translating it into English, she simply told herself, "I need to buy milk" in English, directly in her mind. Initially, it felt strange to switch her thoughts from Russian to English, but with time, it became more natural. She started practicing this method throughout her day, thinking in English when she was driving, walking, or even just observing her surroundings. By practicing these simple daily activities in English, Olga gradually reduced the urge to translate. Her confidence began to grow, and she noticed that she was able to speak more fluidly when she had conversations in English. The key to Olga's success was consistency. By consistently practicing thinking in English and reducing her reliance on translation, she started to feel more comfortable speaking the language. She no longer had to pause and search for the right translation in her head before speaking. Instead, the words began to come to her more naturally. Her fluency improved, and she started feeling more confident in her ability to communicate in English without constantly questioning herself. Olga's story is a perfect example of how overcoming the mental barrier of translation can lead to greater fluency and confidence in speaking. The fear of making mistakes is often exaggerated, and once learners realize that it's okay to make errors and learn from them, their anxiety about speaking in English decreases significantly. The more you practice thinking in English, the more your brain becomes accustomed to processing the language without the need for translation. You begin to trust yourself and your ability to express your thoughts directly in English, which makes speaking more fluid and natural. One of the most important aspects of overcoming psychological barriers is to shift your focus from perfection to progress. Many learners get stuck in the idea that they must speak English perfectly in order to be understood. This mindset can lead to a lot of hesitation and frustration. However, the truth is that native speakers themselves don't always speak perfectly. They make mistakes, they pause to think, and they sometimes use simple phrases to express complex ideas. The key is to focus on communicating your ideas clearly, rather than worrying about making every sentence grammatically perfect. Another important step in building confidence is practicing regularly in situations where you can make mistakes without fear of judgment. It's often easier to practice English with friends or in casual settings where the pressure to be perfect is lower. As you practice in these comfortable environments, your confidence will grow, and you'll be more willing to speak in more formal or challenging situations. For example, imagine you're in a conversation with someone and you're not sure of the correct word or phrase to use. Instead of panicking or resorting to translating, try to explain your idea using simple words or gestures. By focusing on getting your message across, you reduce the pressure you place on yourself to use perfect language. Over time, this approach will help you become more comfortable and confident in your speaking abilities. Another helpful tip is to embrace mistakes as a natural part of the learning process. Every mistake you make is an opportunity to improve, and the more mistakes you make, the more you learn. When Olga stopped translating in her head, she made plenty of mistakes, but she didn't let them discourage her. Instead, she used each mistake as a lesson, learning from it and adjusting her approach. This mindset shift, seeing mistakes as stepping stones rather than failures, helped her overcome the fear of speaking and made her more confident overall. The process of overcoming psychological barriers and building confidence in English is gradual, but it is entirely achievable with the right mindset. By practicing thinking in English and reducing your reliance on translation, you can become more comfortable speaking and less fearful of making mistakes. Confidence grows with time and consistent practice. And once you stop translating in your head, you'll find that speaking English becomes a much more natural and enjoyable experience. Errors are an inevitable part of the language learning process, yet they are often feared and avoided. Many learners believe that mistakes are a sign of failure, and they try to avoid making them at all costs. However, what most people don't realize is that errors are not only natural, they are also essential for growth and progress. The truth is, the more mistakes you make, the faster you will learn. In fact, errors are one of the best ways to learn a language, as they help you identify areas where you need improvement and give you the opportunity to refine your skills. Today, we are going to explore why mistakes are such a vital part of the process and how embracing them can accelerate your journey toward fluency in English. One of the most important things to understand about errors is that they are a sign of effort, not failure. When you're learning a language, you are constantly testing new words, phrases, and structures. The more you try to use the language in real-life situations, the more you expose yourself to mistakes. But rather than being discouraged by these errors, you should see them as a necessary step in the learning process. Every time you make a mistake, you're gaining a deeper understanding of the language. You're learning what works and what doesn't, and you're discovering the areas where you need to focus more. This is especially true when it comes to thinking in English. When you begin the process of thinking directly in English rather than translating, you will undoubtedly make mistakes. You might use the wrong word, misplace the order of your sentences, or even say something that sounds a little awkward. But these mistakes are not a sign of failure. They are simply part of the process of adapting your mind to thinking in English. As you continue to make these mistakes and correct them, you will get better and better at expressing yourself in the language. Let's take the example of Luis, a Mexican man who had been learning English for a few years. Luis was quite good at reading and understanding English, but he found it difficult to speak. The reason for this was simple. He was still mentally translating from Spanish to English every time he tried to communicate. He was so focused on getting the translation right that he often hesitated before speaking, trying to find the perfect word or phrase. This process was time-consuming and left him feeling unsure about his ability to communicate. He knew that he needed to think in English, but the thought of making mistakes held him back. One day, Luis decided to take a different approach. Instead of worrying about making mistakes, he embraced the idea that errors were a natural part of the learning process. He made a conscious decision to stop translating in his head and focus on thinking directly in English. At first, this felt strange. He would think of a word or phrase in Spanish and then try to translate it into English, only to realize that it didn't quite work. He'd make errors, and sometimes the conversation would stall because he couldn't find the right word. But rather than getting frustrated, he saw these mistakes as learning opportunities. Each time he made a mistake, he would mentally note it, figure out what went wrong, and try to do better next time. For example, one day while speaking with a friend, Luis tried to say, "I need to go to the store to buy some fruits." However, he accidentally said, "I need to go to the store for buying fruits." His friend looked a little confused, and Luis immediately realized his mistake. Instead of feeling embarrassed or discouraged, he simply corrected himself. "Sorry, I meant to say, to buy fruits." His friend smiled and reassured him that it was an easy mistake to make, and Luis felt a sense of accomplishment. He had identified the mistake, corrected it, and learned from it. This process of trial and error helped him gain confidence in speaking, and over time he made fewer mistakes as he continued to practice thinking directly in English. Luis's experience shows that mistakes are a crucial part of the learning process. Without making errors, he wouldn't have been able to identify the areas where he needed improvement. Every time he made a mistake and corrected it, he was reinforcing his understanding of how English works. And as he continued to make mistakes, he became more comfortable with the language and more confident in his ability to express himself. The key here is that Luis didn't let his mistakes discourage him. Instead, he used them as stepping stones to improve his fluency. The important thing to remember is that making mistakes is normal, and it's something that every language learner goes through. Even native speakers of English make mistakes all the time. They mix up words, use incorrect grammar, and sometimes say things that don't quite make sense. The difference is that native speakers don't overthink their errors. They simply correct them and move on. Language is all about communication, and the most important thing is to be understood. So, when you make a mistake, don't worry about it too much. Just correct it and keep going. Each time you do, you're one step closer to fluency. Another valuable lesson that Luis learned during his journey was that mistakes are less likely to happen when you take risks. By allowing himself to make mistakes, Luis became more comfortable speaking in English, and he started to take more risks in his conversations. He no longer felt paralyzed by the fear of making an error. Instead, he embraced the idea of speaking without overthinking, knowing that he could always correct himself if needed. This mindset shift allowed him to improve his speaking skills much faster than if he had continued to worry about making mistakes all the time. In fact, research has shown that making mistakes and learning from them is one of the most effective ways to learn a language. Studies have found that learners who embrace errors and use them as opportunities for growth tend to learn faster and retain more information than those who avoid making mistakes. This is because mistakes provide valuable feedback that helps learners adjust their approach and refine their language skills. So the next time you make a mistake in English, remember that it's not a setback. It's a chance to improve. In conclusion, the process of learning English involves making mistakes, and that's completely normal. In fact, it's essential to your growth as a language learner. Every mistake you make brings you one step closer to fluency as long as you embrace it and learn from it. Luis's story is a perfect example of how making mistakes can lead to faster learning and greater confidence. By accepting that errors are a natural part of the process, you can reduce the fear of speaking and begin to focus on communicating your ideas clearly. So, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Embrace them, learn from them, and keep moving forward. The more mistakes you make, the quicker you'll become fluent in English. Practicing English in a group setting is one of the most powerful ways to accelerate your language skills. Whether you're speaking with native speakers or fellow learners, engaging with others provides a unique opportunity to improve your fluency and confidence. The value of group practice goes beyond just improving your vocabulary or pronunciation. It also helps you develop the ability to think in English without relying on translation. In fact, practicing in a group can serve as a valuable tool for overcoming mental blocks and breaking the habit of translating words from your native language. The reason group practice is so beneficial is that it simulates real-life conversations. When you speak with other people, especially those who challenge you to think quickly and respond on the spot, it forces your brain to process information in English directly. This type of spontaneous communication is something you can't replicate by studying alone. When you practice by yourself, it's easy to pause and search for the right word or to go back and correct yourself. But in a group setting, you have to keep the conversation flowing, which encourages your brain to work faster and think in the target language. Let's take the example of a group of Chinese students who practice English together. These students, like many others, initially struggled with translating their thoughts from Chinese into English. They would often hesitate when speaking, trying to figure out how to say something correctly in English. But over time, they realized that the key to improving was to stop translating and start thinking directly in English. So they decided to form a study group where they could practice together, pushing each other to think and speak in English as much as possible. At first, the process was challenging. The students would often revert to Chinese in moments of uncertainty, relying on their native language to fill in the gaps. But they made a conscious effort to communicate only in English during their study sessions, even if it meant making mistakes. The more they practiced, the more comfortable they became with expressing themselves in English, and the less they felt the need to translate in their heads. They would support each other by gently correcting mistakes and offering alternative ways to phrase things. Through this supportive environment, they gradually became more fluent in their ability to think in English. One of the strategies that the students used was to engage in role-playing exercises. For example, they would simulate situations they might encounter in everyday life, such as ordering food at a restaurant or booking a hotel room. By acting out these scenarios, they forced themselves to think on their feet and respond in English without relying on translation. This type of practice helped them to internalize English phrases and expressions, and they started to use them naturally in conversations. Another technique that proved helpful was discussing current events in English. The students would pick a news article or a topic of interest and discuss it as a group. This not only expanded their vocabulary, but also pushed them to think critically and express their opinions in English. Over time, they became more confident in their speaking abilities, and the hesitation to speak started to fade away. One of the students, May, a 23-year-old from Beijing, had been struggling with her spoken English for years. She could read and write in English fairly well, but when it came to speaking, she felt insecure and unsure of herself. She would often find herself thinking in Chinese and then trying to translate her thoughts into English. This slowed down her responses and made her feel frustrated. But after joining the study group, May began to see improvements. At first, she was nervous about making mistakes, but the other students encouraged her to speak freely and to focus on communicating, rather than on being perfect. Gradually, May started to think in English during their conversations, and the more she practiced, the more fluent she became. By the end of the semester, she was able to speak confidently and without hesitation, even in complex discussions. The group dynamic played a significant role in May's transformation. Having the support of others helped her to overcome her fear of making mistakes. In a group setting, there's less pressure to speak perfectly, and everyone is in the same boat. Everyone is learning, and everyone is making mistakes. This creates a comfortable space where learners can practice without feeling self-conscious. The group also provided valuable feedback, which allowed May to fine-tune her English and avoid making the same mistakes repeatedly. Another benefit of group practice is the opportunity to hear different accents and speaking styles. In a diverse group, you are exposed to various ways of speaking English, which can help you develop a more natural and adaptable speaking style. For instance, May's group included students from different regions of China, as well as a few students from other countries, including Japan and South Korea. Each person had their own unique accent, and by interacting with each other, they learned to understand different pronunciations and accents. This made them more adaptable when speaking with native speakers or when traveling abroad. Group practice also helps to build a sense of community and accountability. When you're practicing on your own, it's easy to procrastinate or skip a session, but in a group, you feel a sense of responsibility to show up and participate. This sense of accountability can keep you motivated and committed to your language learning journey. The group members would set goals for themselves and each other, whether it was learning a new set of vocabulary each week or practicing a particular aspect of grammar. By working together, they were able to stay on track and keep improving. 5. Course group practice is not without its challenges. There will always be moments of frustration, especially when communication breaks down or when someone struggles to find the right words. But these challenges are part of the process. The key is to stay patient and to embrace mistakes as learning opportunities. The more you practice with others, the more confident you'll become in your ability to think and speak in English. In summary, practicing in a group is an effective way to improve your English and to make the transition from translating to thinking in English. By interacting with others, you'll be able to practice speaking spontaneously, receive valuable feedback, and gain exposure to different accents and speaking styles. Like May and her friends, you can overcome the challenge of translating in your head and become more fluent in your ability to think in English. The group setting offers a supportive environment where you can take risks, make mistakes, and grow together. So, find a language partner or a study group and start practicing today. As we come to the end of this episode, let's take a quick look back at the key takeaways and how you can start applying what we've discussed in your daily life. Throughout this episode, we've explored the challenges of translating in your head when speaking English, and how it can slow down your fluency and hinder your progress. We've also looked at the importance of thinking in English, which allows you to communicate more naturally, without the need to translate every word. We began by recognizing how the habit of translating from your native language to English can cause you to hesitate and second-guess yourself when speaking. This process not only affects your speaking speed, but can also cause unnecessary confusion as you try to find the right words or structure sentences in your head. It's a natural part of the learning process, but to truly improve your fluency, it's essential to break this habit and start thinking directly in English. The first step is simple. Practice thinking in English during your daily activities. Start small by focusing on easy, everyday situations where you can train your mind to form thoughts in English. For instance, when you're cooking, try to think about the steps in English instead of your native language. When you're walking around town or taking public transport, describe the things you see in English in your mind. These small exercises gradually train your brain to switch from translation to direct thought in English. Next, we discussed the importance of using simple, clear language. Many learners feel the pressure to speak perfectly, but the key to becoming fluent is to start using simple phrases that are easy to understand. You don't need to know every word in the dictionary to communicate effectively. By focusing on clarity and simplicity, you'll be able to express yourself more confidently without getting bogged down by the fear of making mistakes. As you build your confidence with simpler phrases, you'll naturally expand your vocabulary and start using more complex sentences. We also talked about associating English words with images and emotions. This helps to reinforce your memory and makes it easier for your brain to access words when you need them. For example, when you think of your favorite food in English, try to associate the word with the image of the dish and how it makes you feel. This technique allows you to internalize vocabulary in a way that feels more natural, rather than relying on a direct translation from your native language. One powerful method for improving fluency is to visualize situations in English, which we also touched on in the episode. Instead of mentally translating every sentence, imagine yourself in a situation where you are speaking in English. For example, if you're planning a trip, visualize yourself booking a hotel room or ordering food at a restaurant, all in English. This exercise forces your brain to think in the target language and helps you overcome the habit of translating. Another essential tip was the importance of consistent practice. Just like any new skill, thinking in English requires regular practice. Set aside a few minutes each day to focus on thinking in English, whether it's through reading, listening, or speaking. The more you practice, the more natural it will become, and soon you'll notice that English is the first language that comes to mind when you think or speak. We also discussed the value of practicing with others. Whether it's with a group of friends, a study partner, or even an online language exchange, practicing speaking with others helps you gain confidence and develop the ability to think on the spot. Group practice is a great way to simulate real-life conversations and push yourself to communicate in English without relying on translation. You don't need to wait until you're perfect to start speaking. The more you practice with others, the more you'll be able to improve and refine your skills. As we wrap up, remember that the key to fluency is not perfection, but progress. Don't worry about making mistakes. That's part of the learning process. Each mistake is an opportunity to improve and get one step closer to thinking and speaking in English as naturally as you do in your native language. I encourage you to apply these techniques every day. Start by choosing simple tasks or routines and practice thinking about them in English. Focus on clarity over complexity, and don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way. With consistent practice and the right mindset, you'll find that thinking in English becomes easier, and your fluency will improve dramatically. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of the English Talk Community. I hope these tips and strategies will help you make the shift from translating to thinking in English. Keep practicing, stay patient, and remember that every step forward is progress. As we near the end of today's episode, I want to take a moment to reflect on what we've discussed and to encourage you to think about your own journey with the English language. Throughout this podcast, we've talked about shifting from translating in your head to thinking directly in English. We've also discussed the importance of practicing consistently, using simple phrases, and incorporating English into your everyday life. Now I want to hear from you. Take a moment and think about how you've been learning English so far. Do you often find yourself translating in your head when you speak, or have you started to feel more comfortable thinking directly in English? What challenges have you faced along the way, and what methods have you found most effective for improving your fluency? Reflecting on your own experiences can be a powerful way to assess where you are in your language learning journey and to pinpoint areas where you might need to focus more attention. I'd love to hear about your experiences. How has the process of thinking in English impacted your speaking, listening, or overall confidence? Have you tried some of the strategies we've discussed today, such as using simple language or visualizing situations in English? It's always inspiring to hear how others are applying these techniques, and your story could be just what someone else needs to hear to keep going on their own language learning journey. So, here's your call to action. I invite you to take a moment right now to reflect on your personal experiences with learning English and to think about what steps you can take to apply the strategies we've discussed today. Perhaps you've been translating less already, or maybe you've found new ways to incorporate English into your daily routine. Whatever it is, I encourage you to make a note of it and think about how you can continue to improve. If you found today's episode helpful, please consider subscribing to the English Talk Community podcast so you can stay updated on future episodes. And don't forget to share your own learning journey with us. You can connect with us on social media or send us a message with your stories, challenges, and triumphs. Whether you're just starting out or you've been learning English for years, your story is valuable, and sharing it with others can be incredibly motivating. By subscribing, you'll also have access to more content that will help you continue improving your English skills. We'll explore new topics, tips, and techniques to keep you on track toward fluency, so make sure to hit that subscribe button. Lastly, I encourage you to share this podcast with anyone you know who might benefit from it. Language learning is a journey, and the more we support each other along the way, the easier and more enjoyable it becomes. So, share this episode with your friends, family, or fellow language learners. Let's continue to build a community of learners who support one another and grow together. Thank you so much for being here today, and I can't wait to hear about your progress and experiences. Remember, every step you take, no matter how small, brings you closer to your goal. Keep practicing, keep reflecting, and keep moving forward. I look forward to connecting with you in the next episode.